January 1944. The Reich Air Ministry in Berlin. It is more than a building. It is a declaration. A tavern of polished marble, vast colonnades and vaulted ceilings, all designed to project an image of immutable power, insulated from the distant, inconvenient thunder of a war its masters believed they had already mastered. Here, in the heart of this architectural boast, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe and second man in the Reich, held court. His confidence, like the building around him, was monumental and just as hollow. When aides, their faces etched with a concern that dared not speak its name, brought him the latest intelligence reports, fragmentary whispers of a new long-range American fighter, he waved them away with a flourish of theatrical contempt. "The Americans can build planes," he had once famously boasted, "but they are experts at building only refrigerators and razor blades." He saw the war not as a matter of industrial attrition, but as a contest of will, of spirit, of a superior martial race against a decadent nation of shopkeepers. He assured his staff, his generals, and most importantly, his Führer, that no American fighter could ever escort a bomber to Berlin. To do so was a technical impossibility, a fantasy. In Göring's mind, the skies over the capital of his thousand-year Reich were inviolable, protected by the finest pilots, the Experten, and the most advanced interceptors in the world. He had built the Luftwaffe from the ashes of the Great War into a terror that had shattered nations. He had unleashed it upon the terrified refugees of Poland, upon the broken armies of France, upon the defiant cities of Britain. He believed in its creation with the blind faith of a zealot. He believed in its invincibility, and so he laughed. He laughed at the very idea of a little friend, some insignificant, over-engineered American escort daring to challenge his dominion over the heart of Europe. This is the story of that laugh and the silence that followed. It's the story of a German general, a composite of the pride, the brilliance, and the fatal arrogance of the Luftwaffe High Command, who stood at the absolute pinnacle of air power. And it is the story of the weapon, the unorthodox solution he dismissed, that would systematically dismantle his empire, piece by piece, in the cold, clear, unforgiving skies over the capital of the Third Reich. This is a story about the moment when a joke became a eulogy, and a little friend became a grim reaper. This is the story of how the P-51 Mustang taught the self-proclaimed masters of the sky a final, brutal lesson in humility. February 19th, 1944, 23:34 hours. RAF Binbrook, Lincolnshire. The night air hangs heavy, a cold, damp shroud thick with the smells of English earth, hot oil, and the sharp, sweet perfume of high-octane aviation fuel. The low guttural roar of 400 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines tear at the fabric of the darkness, a sound that is both a promise and a threat. On the tarmac, slick with a fine mist, the Lancaster bomber JB-610, call sign V Victor, part of a thundering stream of nearly 900 Commonwealth aircraft, begins its takeoff roll. Its bomb bay is filled with high explosives and incendiaries. Its target is Leipzig, a major industrial heart of the German war machine. This is the opening act of a new, terrifying phase of the air war. The Allies have given it a deceptively simple code name, Operation Argument. History, written in fire and aluminum, would remember it as Big Week. Miles away, inside the sterile confines of the Reich Air Ministry, the mood is one of grim, practiced confidence. For our general,
Let us call him Friedrich von Beck, a man who embodies the spirit of the Luftwaffe's now fading golden age. This is merely another test of a proven, deadly system. Beck, a veteran of the Condor Legion in Spain and the furious dogfights over the English Channel during the Battle of Britain, has seen it all. He trusts his pilots, the handful of remaining expertin who have survived years of relentless combat, and he trusts their machines, the formidable radial-engined Focke-Wulf 190 and the latest high-altitude variants of the legendary Messerschmitt Bun 09. The dire situation, as Beck sees it, is not his, but the Americans'. The U.S. 8th Air Force has been bleeding, hemorrhaging crews and machines in the hostile skies over the Reich. Their audacious, distinctly American strategy of high-altitude daylight precision bombing has been a near disaster. Raids deep into Germany in the latter half of 1943, targeting the ball bearing factories of Schweinfurt and the aircraft plants of Regensburg, saw catastrophic, unsustainable losses. Unescorted B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were systematically savaged by Beck's meticulously orchestrated fighter wings. The American bomber crews, young men barely out of their teens, called it Black Thursday. The Luftwaffe pilots, with cold professionalism, simply called it a turkey shoot. The prevailing, unshakable wisdom inside the German High Command is that deep penetration daylight raids are tactical suicide. The prohibiting order, in this context, is not a single command barked over the telephone, but a deeply ingrained institutional dogma, a strategic article of faith championed by Göring and enforced with rigid certainty by generals like Beck. The enemy cannot reach our heartland in force, in daylight, and survive. This belief dictates everything: fighter deployment, fuel allocation, pilot training, and technological development. The Luftwaffe's finest fighter groups are held back, defending the core of Germany, while others are diverted to the brutal, grinding war on the Eastern Front, all under the confident assumption that the Western daylight threat is effectively contained. The core of Germany, and especially the sacred capital of Berlin, is considered an inassailable fortress of flak and fighters. The forbidden tool, the one laughed out of staff meetings and dismissed in intelligence briefings, is the very concept of a long-range escort fighter. German engineers, brilliant as they were, had long ago deemed it an unsolvable puzzle. The laws of aeronautics, as they understood them, presented a cruel paradox. To give a single-engine fighter enough fuel to fly to Berlin and back, one would have to add so much weight in fuel tanks that the aircraft would become a clumsy, unmaneuverable liability, incapable of fighting. Early American attempts, like the powerful but short-legged P-47 Thunderbolt and the twin-engined P-38 Lightning, had tried and failed, their range falling frustratingly short. They would bring the bombers to the doorstep of the Reich, only to peel away, leaving the heavies to fend for themselves. When intelligence whispers of a new American plane, a North American P-51 Mustang, the initial reaction is dismissive. The first Allison engine models had been mediocre, unimpressive at the high altitudes where the real fighting took place. The Germans even have a name for these escorts that are forced to turn back early: little friends. It is a term of pure derision. On the eve of Big Week, General Beck sits under the cold light of his office lamp, reviewing the readiness reports. His forces are stretched, yes, but they are potent. He dismisses the scattered reports of a new Mustang variant fitted with a British engine. It sounds like a desperate, clumsy Anglo-American experiment, a hybrid born of desperation. His defiant decision, therefore, is not made in a moment of high drama, but in the quiet, sterile, and logical calm of his Berlin office. He will not redeploy his best fighter groups from other fronts. He will not alter their aggressive, time-tested, head-on attack strategies that have worked so devastatingly well against the unescorted bombers. He will trust the system. He will hold the line. He has no idea that this quiet, logical, and profoundly arrogant decision is the trigger for his own demise. He is maintaining a protocol that is already obsolete. He is preparing for a war that, in a matter of days, will cease to exist. His Luftwaffe, the pride of the Reich, is flying, unknowingly, directly into the jaws of a revolution.
General Friedrich von Beck was not a fool. Far from it. He was a dangerous combination of intelligence, experience, and dogma. He was a product of a system that had, until this very moment, rewarded his worldview with staggering, intoxicating success. To understand his fatal miscalculation, you must first understand the man and the culture that forged him. Born into a long line of Prussian military officers, Beck was a creature of discipline, duty, and tradition. But as a young man in the heady days of the Weimar Republic, he was seduced by the siren song of the sky. He was a gifted aviator in the 1920s, a barnstormer and air racer who saw the world not in the muddy confines of borders and trenches that had consumed his father's generation, but in the limitless freedom of wind currents and vertical space. He joined the clandestine air force Germany was building in secret, in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, and in the sun-drenched, dusty crucible of the Spanish Civil War, he honed his skills. Flying with the Condor Legion, he helped develop the very tactics that would become the Luftwaffe's deadly playbook: the Finger Four formation, the dive-bombing attack, the concept of air power as the swift, decisive tip of the spear. His passion was the purity of the dogfight, the individual contest of skill, aggression, and nerve between pilots. He saw air combat as a modern form of a nightly duel played out at 30,000 feet. This background, this obsession with the technical perfection of his aircraft and the elite, almost mystical skill of his pilots, was both his greatest strength and his most profound, tragic weakness. He believed wars were won by superior men and superior machines, not by the grinding, soulless industrial attrition that the Americans were beginning to perfect. He simply could not conceive of an enemy that would overwhelm him with sheer, inexhaustible numbers of a machine that was not just numerous, but lethally effective. The strategic context of early 1944 was a nightmare for the Allies, a reality that reinforced Beck's confidence. Their combined bomber offensive, the great Anglo-American strategic gamble, was stalling. The goal was simple and brutal: to cripple Germany's aircraft industry before the planned D-Day landings. Without air superiority over the beaches of Normandy, the invasion would be a bloodbath, torn apart by the Luftwaffe and Panzer divisions. But the cost of achieving that goal was becoming unbearable. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a horrific, politically dangerous rate. Young men from every state in the Union were falling from the sky in shattered, burning fortresses of aluminum and fire. The Luftwaffe's defensive system, orchestrated by men like Beck, was brutally effective. Fighters were vectored by ground controllers, massing into powerful battle groups, the Gefechtsverband, that would attack the bomber streams from multiple directions with cannons, rockets, and even aerial bombs. Beck's fighters were the tip of that spear. Feared units like Jagdgeschwader 26, the Abbeville boys, who were veterans of the Channel Front, were masters of their craft. Jagdgeschwader 2, Richthofen, carried the legacy of the Red Baron himself. They would wait, patiently, for the American escorts to reach the absolute limit of their range and turn for home. And then, like wolves falling upon a scattered flock, they would descend upon the now defenseless bomber streams. General Beck's team, his inner circle, reflected his own unshakable confidence. His adjutant, a young, ambitious major named Klaus Richter, was a true believer, a product of the Hitler Youth, who saw the war in stark ideological terms.
Richter kept the kill ratio charts, an ever-climbing testament to what he saw as clear German superiority. He would bring back the daily reports, his face beaming with pride. "Another 60 American bombers down today, Herr General, at the cost of only 10 of our fighters." They were winning. The numbers, he believed, proved it. Beck's senior pilots, men like Hauptmann Erich Weiss, a 100 victory ace recently transferred from the brutal Eastern Front, were living legends. Weiss was from a small village in Bavaria, a farmer's son who flew his Focke-Wulf with an almost poetic violence. He and his squadron, the Sturmvogel, or Stormbirds, were the anointed guardians of the Reich. They were confident, cocky, and utterly lethal. But the situation, for those willing to look past the triumphant headlines of the propaganda ministry, was beginning to worsen, subtly at first. The Big Week bombing campaign, which began on February 20th, 1944, was relentless. For 6 straight days, massive formations of American and British bombers struck aircraft factories across the length and breadth of Germany. The scale was unprecedented. More than 1,000 American bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, struck on the first day alone. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, and the skies over Brunswick, Leipzig, and Augsburg became a 3-dimensional maelstrom of contrails, trace of fire, and explosions. The Germans inflicted heavy losses. The Americans lost 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters in that single brutal week. But the Luftwaffe also paid a staggering, irreplaceable price. A third of its available fighters were lost, and more critically, nearly a fifth of its veteran pilots, the core of the Experten, were killed or wounded. Panicked, unfiltered calls started to filter into Beck's headquarters, bypassing the official reports. A young pilot, overwhelmed and his voice cracking with adrenaline, radios in, "There are so many of them, they keep coming, wave after wave." An experienced group commander, his voice tight with controlled alarm, reports something strange, something new. The escorts. They stayed with the bombers longer this time, much longer, all the way to the target. The official plan, the entire defensive strategy built on the certainty of the little friends turning back, was starting to fray at the edges. Command's response from Berlin was chillingly calm, detached from the terrifying reality of the air battles. "Press your attacks, maintain discipline, the Reich depends on you." But on the frozen, muddy airfields of occupied France and Germany, a cold dread was beginning to set in. The pilots, the men who had to fly into that meat grinder every day, could feel it. The attrition was insustainable. They were killing the enemy, but the enemy just kept coming. And somewhere, out over the gray, cold expanse of the North Sea, a new predator was sharpening its claws, preparing to make a mockery of everything General von Beck believed to be true.
The unorthodox solution to the American crisis was not born in a single flash of battlefield genius, but in the quiet, desperate calculus of engineers and strategists, thousands of miles from the fight. It was a story of 2 nations and 2 of their greatest creations. The problem was range. The solution was a marriage of convenience that became one of the most inspired and consequential acts of the entire war. The American P-51 Mustang, an aircraft with a sleek, revolutionary laminar flow wing design, was a promising but deeply flawed aircraft. It was fast and agile down low, but its American-made Allison engine suffered from poor performance at high altitudes. It was a sports car with the lungs of a marathon runner. Meanwhile, the British had the perfect engine, the magnificent Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same 2-stage, 2-speed supercharged power plant that gave the Spitfire its legendary performance at altitude. In a moment of cross-Atlantic collaboration, a handful of Mustangs were experimentally fitted with the Merlin.
The result was not just an improvement, it was a revelation. A plane that had been merely adequate was transformed into a world beater, an aeronautical chimera with the endurance of an American design and the heart of a British thoroughbred. The new Merlin-powered P-51B could fly higher, faster, and critically, farther than any single-engine fighter the Germans possessed. When equipped with two 108-gallon external drop tanks, its combat radius stretched to an astonishing 650 miles. Suddenly, no target in Germany was safe. Berlin, Munich, Vienna, they were all within reach. The impossible had become reality. The aha moment, the strategic spark that weaponized this new technology, belonged to the new commander of the 8th Air Force, Lieutenant General James "Jimmy" Doolittle. Doolittle was no desk-bound general. He was the famed leader of the audacious 1942 raid on Tokyo, a man who understood calculated risks and the psychological impact of striking the enemy in his heartland. He looked at the faltering bomber offensive, the mounting casualty lists, and the arrival of his new long-legged P-51s, and he made a revolutionary decision. He tore up the existing playbook. On a visit to 8th Fighter Command Headquarters, he saw a sign on the wall that read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle reportedly pointed at it and said, "Take that sign down." Its replacement would reflect a new, predatory philosophy. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. This was a seismic, tectonic shift in doctrine. The fighters were unleashed. No longer would they be tethered to the plodding bomber formations in a passive, defensive screen. Doolittle's new orders were brutally simple. Seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. He sent his Mustangs far ahead of the bomber streams in aggressive fighter sweeps, their mission to circle German airfields, to hunt down and kill German interceptors as they were taking off, before they could even form up to reach the bombers. He was deliberately, cynically using his multi-million-dollar bomber formations as bait, daring the Luftwaffe to come up and fight a battle they could no longer win. The execution of this new strategy reached its terrifying, spectacular climax on March 6, 1944. This was the day the air war over Europe changed forever. Over 700 American heavy bombers, a river of silver and steel miles long, escorted by nearly 800 fighters, P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s, set a course for the ultimate target, the capital of the Reich, Berlin. For the defenders, it was a day that began with disbelief and ended in sheer horror. As the first reports from radar stations crackled into the command bunkers, General von Beck and his staff at the Air Ministry assumed it was a feint, a diversion. The main force would surely turn towards the familiar targets in Western Germany. But they kept coming. Past Hamburg, past the Elbe River, deeper and deeper into the Reich's supposedly sacred airspace. Luftwaffe fighter groups scrambled from their frozen bases, pilots pulling on their gear as the sirens wailed. They were the best in the world, confident in their abilities and their machines. They rose through the scattered clouds, forming up into their disciplined attack formations, expecting to find lumbering, undefended bombers, ripe for the kill once the little friends had turned for home. Instead, they found a sky of sharks. From the enemy's perspective, the psychological impact was catastrophic. A German ace, Hauptmann Moeller, a veteran of 100 combats, is leading a group of F-190s. Through his canopy, he spots the bomber stream, a formation of glittering specks in the distant sun. He gives the order to attack. His pilots roll into their dives,
commencing the time-tested head-on pass that has shattered so many B-17 formations, their 20mm cannons armed and ready, but then something is wrong. From high above, streaks of silver detach themselves from the blinding glare of the sun. P-51 Mustangs. Not a handful, but dozens upon dozens. They are not supposed to be here. Not this deep. Not over Berlin. Moeller watches in disbelief as the Mustangs jettison their wing tanks, which tumble down like silver teardrops, a clear, unmistakable sign that they are here to stay and here to fight. The German radio channels, which were routinely monitored by the Allies, exploded into a cacophony of panic and confusion. Achtung, Indianer! Überall Indianer! Attention, bandits, bandits everywhere! The disciplined German formations, designed to methodically dissect bomber streams, were thrown into complete chaos as they were forced into swirling, defensive dogfights against a superior opponent. The P-51 was faster at high altitude, more agile in a dive, and its 6.50 caliber machine guns, while lighter than German cannon, had a higher rate of fire and a flatter trajectory, acting like a buzzsaw that could tear a Messerschmitt apart. German pilots who had spent years honing their specific skills against heavy bombers suddenly found themselves in a fight for their very lives against an aircraft that could outturn, outrun, and outclimb them at the altitudes that mattered. The Great Escape was not for the Germans, but for the American bombers. For the very first time, they flew over the heart of Berlin with a protective shield of friendly fighters clearing the way above, below, and around them. The controlled collapse was that of the Luftwaffe's entire defensive strategy, a strategy built on a foundation of arrogance that had just been dynamited. The myth of the inviolable Reich was shattered in a single brutal afternoon. That day, which came to be known as Black Monday for the heavy losses the Americans still sustained, was a strategic victory of immense, war-altering proportions. The 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers, a terrible price in human life, but the Luftwaffe lost scores of its best fighters and, more importantly, its most experienced pilots. These were men who could not be replaced. The American industrial machine could produce endless P-51s. The German war machine could not produce endless aces. In the aftermath, a new legend was born. Not of a ghost battery, but of a sky that was never empty. Captured German pilots in their post-mission interrogations spoke with a new tone, a sense of awe mixed with despair. They described facing an overwhelming force, a relentless churning wave of silver-nosed fighters that seemed to come from nowhere and be everywhere at once. One German pilot famously remarked that the Mustangs seemed to be nailed to the bomber's wings. The little friend had become a constant, terrifying, ever-present companion. For Hermann Göring, the shock was profound and personal. Upon being told that American fighters were circling unchallenged over Berlin, he is reported to have furiously said, "I knew this would happen. I always said it would happen." And later, more despairingly, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." The arrogant laugh that had echoed through the marble halls of the Air Ministry in January had died in his throat, choked by the contrails of the revolution he had refused to believe was possible.
The first people to validate the genius of Doolittle's strategy were not his superiors in Washington, but his enemies on the frozen airfields of Germany. The peer recognition came in the form of fear, anger, and a growing sense of betrayal within the Luftwaffe's own ranks. Younger frontline pilots, the men who had to fly into the silver swarms day after day, saw the truth with brutal, terrifying clarity. They knew their tactics were failing. Their aircraft were now dangerously outclassed, and their leadership, from the Reichsmarschall down, was lying to them, feeding them a diet of propaganda while they were being systematically annihilated.
The once unquestionable, almost cult-like confidence of the German fighter arm began to crack, then shatter. This simmering resentment boiled over in what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt in the early days of 1945. It was a last desperate cry from the heart of a dying service. Led by decorated and respected aces like Günther Lützow and Johannes Steinhoff, a group of high-ranking fighter commanders confronted Hermann Göring directly. This was not just insubordination. In the Third Reich, it was a suicidal act of defiance. They accused him of incompetence, of mismanaging aircraft production in favor of bombers, and of sending them on missions that were nothing short of suicide. At one famous earlier confrontation during the Battle of Britain, when Göring had arrogantly asked his top aces what they needed to win, the straight-talking ace Adolf Galland had famously replied, "I should like an outfit of Spitfires for my squadron." Now, years later, the sentiment was the same, but laced with the bitterness and desperation of a losing war. They had lost all faith in their leadership and their equipment. The appearance of the P-51 over Berlin was the moment the balance had irrevocably tipped, and these pilots, the men at the sharp end, knew it in their bones. The tense debriefing for our composite character, General Friedrich von Beck, would have been a scene of pure political theater, a brutal passion play staged for an audience of one, Adolf Hitler. In a smoke-filled room in the Air Ministry, or perhaps at the Wolf's Lair itself, surrounded by Göring and other sycophantic Nazi Party officials, the blame is passed down like a live grenade. Göring, a master of self-preservation, would not accept failure. He would rage, his face purple, accusing his pilots of cowardice, of lacking the true National Socialist fighting spirit. "You have failed the Führer. You have failed the German people. Your hearts are not in the fight." The violation is clear, a stain upon the honor of the Luftwaffe. You allowed the Anglo-American air gangsters to bomb our capital in broad daylight. You personally promised me this was an impossibility. General Beck's defense is not an excuse. It is the cold, irrefutable logic of a broken equation. He would stand stiffly, his face a mask of iron control, and present the facts, the combat reports, the kill-to-loss ratios that were now horrifically, catastrophically inverted. Reichsmarschall, he might state, his voice cold and precise, each word a chip of ice. "My pilots are not cowards. They are dead. We are facing an enemy with a fighter that can escort their bombers to any target in the Reich, and which can outfight our own interceptors at high altitude. They are fighting in numbers we cannot hope to match. Our replacement pilots are inadequately trained. Our fuel supplies are critical. We cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy who can replace their losses in weeks, while we cannot replace our best men at all. This is not a failure of spirit. It is a failure of mathematics." And this was a truth the High Command, steeped in its own mythology of will and destiny, did not want to hear. The grudging vindication for the pilots, if not for Beck, was that tactics had to change, but it was far too little, far too late. The Luftwaffe was forced to abandon its concentrated, massed attacks on bomber formations and instead focus on sheer survival. Production shifted frantically, desperately towards new wonder weapons like the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter. But the jets, while revolutionary, were a logistical nightmare. They required highly trained pilots, special concrete runways, and vast amounts of fuel. Three resources the crumbling Reich no longer had. The training program for new pilots had been slashed to the bone. By early 1944, a new Luftwaffe pilot received only about 160 flying hours before being sent into combat, compared to over 400 hours for his Allied counterpart, who also had the luxury of extensive gunnery and tactical training. They were lambs being sent to the slaughter. In February 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 aircraft simply to accidents, training mishaps, fuel starvation, mechanical failures, a shadow army of ghosts lost before they even saw the enemy, a testament to a system in complete collapse. General von Beck's humble reward for speaking the unvarnished truth would be his immediate dismissal. He would be relieved of his command, perhaps shunted off to a meaningless desk job in Italy, or worse, put under house arrest, a convenient and high-ranking scapegoat for Göring's colossal, unforgivable failure. The real-life general of the fighter arm, Adolf Galland, was similarly dismissed after clashing with Göring, only to be reinstated by Hitler's personal intervention to lead an elite squadron of Messerschmitt 262 jet fighters. For our General Beck, his career, built on a foundation of victory, prestige, and iron certainty, ends not with a bang, but with a quiet, humiliating whimper. The ripple effect of this collapse at the top was the complete and utter demoralization of the Luftwaffe. From March 1944 onward, they were fighting a purely defensive war. Their numbers dwindling, their fuel reserves evaporating, their morale shattered, and their once sovereign skies filled with the seemingly endless arrogant contrails of America's little friend. The hunter had become the hunted. The sword of the Reich had been broken over the knee of American industrial might.
The ultimate proof of the P-51 Mustang's genius was not just in the battles it won, but in the entire military doctrine it shattered and then rewrote from scratch. The once forbidden, technically impossible tactic of long-range fighter escort became the absolute cornerstone of Allied air strategy, the key that unlocked the door to Fortress Europe. But the true revolutionary shift was more profound. Doolittle's deceptively simple order to destroy German fighters changed the very objective of the air war. The new unwritten doctrine could be called attrition supremacy. It was a cold, brutal, and terrifyingly effective philosophy. Force the enemy to fight a battle he cannot win. Bleed him of his most valuable and irreplaceable asset, his experienced pilots, and the war in the air is over. The bombers, the B-17s and B-24s, became in effect the lure in a gigantic aerial ambush that stretched across the entire Third Reich. The success of this doctrine directly, unequivocally, enabled the success of the D-Day landings. By June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe's once mighty fighter arm had been so savaged, so bled white in the skies over Germany, that it could offer only sporadic, token resistance over the beaches of Normandy. This allowed the Allied invasion to proceed without the catastrophic air attacks that military planners had feared most, saving countless lives on the ground. Archived testimonies from the men who were there, letters and diaries written in the quiet moments between missions, paint a vivid picture of this turning point. A letter from a B-17 waist gunner, Sergeant Jack Riley of the Hard Luck 100th Bomb Group, written to his mother in Ohio, reads, "Before the Mustangs, you counted the holes in the plane when you got back, and you counted the empty bunks in the barracks. After the Mustangs showed up in force, you just thanked God they were there. You'd be flying along, scared stiff, and then you'd see them zipping past your window, their pilots giving you a little wave. And you knew you had a chance. They were the most beautiful thing I ever saw in the sky." From the other side, from the vanquished, the words carry an even greater, more somber weight. In a post-war interrogation, the legendary German ace Johannes Steinhoff,
who had survived being shot down multiple times and was a key figure in the fighter pilots' revolt, reflected on the change with the clarity of a man who had seen hell up close. "The appearance of the American long-range escort fighter," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "was the most significant and, for us, the most disastrous development of the air war. We were forced into a fight we could not win on their terms. Our best men, the core of our experience, were lost in a matter of months. It was the beginning of the end." General Friedrich von Beck, our symbol of the Luftwaffe's hubris and pride, would have lived out his remaining days in quiet, bitter obscurity. Stripped of his rank and prestige, he might have returned to a small, crumbling family home in the Bavarian countryside, the thunder of American F-84 Thunderjet engines from a nearby NATO airbase, a constant, grating daily reminder of his failure and his nation's defeat. The contrast is powerful and deeply ironic. The man who once commanded the skies, who saw himself as a modern knight, now a forgotten ghost, haunted by the memory of silver wings flashing in the sun over his capital. But the true emotional climax, the final undeniable confession, comes not from a fictional general, but from the very top, from the man who laughed the loudest. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, the architect of the Luftwaffe, the swaggering metal-bedecked paladin of the Third Reich, provided the ultimate eulogy for his own creation. Captured at the end of the war, he was interrogated by the top American air commanders at Nuremberg. General Karl Spaatz, the commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, the man who had overseen the destruction of Germany from the air, asked him a simple, direct question. When did he first realize that Germany was truly defeated? Göring's reply was unequivocal. He didn't speak of the frozen hell of Stalingrad, or the beaches of Normandy, or the unstoppable tide of the Red Army at the gates of Berlin. He spoke of the little friend. Sitting there, stripped of his medals and his authority, he looked at his captors and stated, with the flat finality of a death sentence, "When I saw your bombers over Berlin, protected by your long-range fighters, I knew then that the Luftwaffe would be unable to stop your bombers. I knew that our weapons plants would be systematically destroyed and that your armies would land in France. Our defeat was inevitable." The story of the German general who laughed at the P-51 Mustang is the story of a system that fell victim to its own blinding arrogance. It is a testament to the brutal fact that no strategy, no matter how successful in the past, is immune to the relentless, unforgiving march of innovation. The little friend was more than just a machine of aluminum, steel, and plexiglass. It was the physical embodiment of a new way of thinking, a symbol of industrial might and tactical flexibility that the rigid, dogmatic, and ultimately self-defeating leadership of the Luftwaffe could not comprehend until it was far, far too late. And maybe that's the real, enduring lesson, that history does not forgive those who refuse to see the future, even when it is flying straight at them at 400 miles per hour.